Traumatic brain injury is an alteration in brain function or other evidence of brain pathology caused by an external force. The cerebellum is located above the brainstem and towards the back of the brain. Its purpose is the coordination of voluntary motor movement, balance, and equilibrium and muscle tone. Ways to tell the cerebellum was damaged is by slow and uncoordinated movements as well as sway and stagger when walking. If your cerebellum is damaged, you can experience loss of coordination of motor movement, the inability to judge distance and when to stop, the inability to perform rapid alternating movement tremors, staggering, wide-based walking, tendency toward falling, weak muscles, slurred speech, and abnormal eye movements.
Today we're going to do our practical evaluation for the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part of the brain in the back that coordinates our movement without our ever having to think about it. So we bend over and tie our shoes. We don't have to think about our back muscles. And people who have problems with their cerebellum, they know that they have to think about all the movements that they do. They have to really be more conscious of that. And that's a sign that their cerebellum's not working. So let's run through the practical examination. These are tests that you can do at home to evaluate whether your cerebellum is working for you. So the first test we do is put our feet together and then close our eyes. And we're looking for swaying or something like that, some uncoordination. From this position, we bring our arms up in front of us and we're looking for any deviation. So if they come up and they're like this, we know that the cerebellum is probably not coordinating well. From this position, we use our pinkies, again with the eyes closed, and we take the pinky into the nose. And it's tip to tip, just like that. And tip to tip on the other side. And if there's a problem with the cerebellum, we'll notice things like this, and you'll need somebody to watch you. They'll come in and they'll be shaky.
The frontal lobe is our emotional control center as well as the home to our personality. It is involved in motor function, problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, initiation, judgment, impulse control, and social and sexual behavior. The frontal area is the most common area of injury. The main differences between the left and right lobes is that the left lobe controls language-related movements when the right lobe is involved in nonverbal movements. If the frontal lobe is damaged, you may experience loss of fine movements and strength of the arms, hands and fingers, spontaneous facial expressions, difficulty speaking, difficulty interpreting feedback from the environment, and dramatic change in social behavior. If you have damage to your right frontal lobe, you could experience depression, excessive sleeping, or unprovoked bouts of crying. However, if you damage your left frontal lobe, you can experience antisocial behavior, diminished empathy, and remorse.
What is a frontal lobe injury? A frontal lobe injury is a traumatic injury to the portion of the brain behind the forehead, which is responsible for our emotions, our personalities, and our executive functioning. Hi, I'm attorney Robert Jarchi, and today's topic is frontal lobe injury. A frontal lobe injury typically occurs when the brain strikes the skull during a traumatic blow to the head, for example, during a motor vehicle collision. The frontal lobe is one of the most commonly injured regions of the brain. The frontal lobe is one of the four main lobes of the brain, which include the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobes. The frontal lobe is positioned at the frontmost region of the brain and integrates all components of human behavior on the highest of levels. The frontal lobe is responsible for what is known as executive functioning. That is to say, the ability to plan, to weigh benefits and risks, and choose between alternate actions. It is also the emotional center and where our personalities reside.
The occipital lobe is the center of our visual perception system. This part of the brain is not easily damaged because of the location, but if it is, it could lead to changes in your visual perceptual system, like field deficits. The pariestrate region is responsible for visual spatial processing, discrimination of movement, and color discrimination. Damage to one side of the occipital lobe could cause exact loss of vision in both eyes, and visual hallucinations, which are visual images caused by no stimuli, and illusions, which is a disordered perception. Abnormality in the parietal, temporal, occipital lobe could lead to word blindness with writing impairments.
Occipital lobes. The occipital lobes are important for perception of visual information. Areas in the inferior temporal visual association cortex are important for recognition of color and shape, as well as recognition of faces. Projections from the occipital lobe to the superior temporal parietal area are important for perceiving motion of objects.
The parietal lobe is divided into two regions. One involves sensation and perception, and the other involves integrating sensory input. If a person experiences damage to the left lobe, it is called Gerstmann syndrome. They will experience confusion between right and left, difficulty with writing and math, language disorders, inability to perceive objects normally, and their verbal memory is affected. However, if there is damage to the right lobe, you will neglect part of the body, have impaired self-care skills, difficulty making things, denial of deficits, and a change in personality. If there is damage to both sides, it is also known as Balance syndrome. Some of the traits of this are the inability to control the gaze, the inability to integrate components of visual, and the inability to reach for an object with visual guidance.
Let's get right into it. The parietal lobe, as you can see here, is this region right here. And we're starting at the central sulcus. It goes down, and on the inferior end over here we have the lateral cerebral fissure, and posteriorly we have the parieto-occipital fissure that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Now, the parietal lobe is primarily involved in perceiving and processing somatosensory events. So we're talking about things like touch and temperature and body position and pain. So the term that we use for body position is proprioception, and the term that we use for pain is nociception. Okay, so proprioception and nociception, those are also involved in the processing of the parietal lobe.
The brainstem is vulnerable to trauma because of its location. It plays a role in attention, arousal, and consciousness. If a brainstem is damaged, there are many symptoms one would experience, such as symptoms of vertigo, trouble swallowing food, trouble with balance and movement, their heart rate is affected, and they can't maintain their body temperature.
So let's get right into it. Now here we're looking at the human brain, and here we'll see we have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord enters the skull, and where it enters the cranium, the skull, it then becomes brain. And the first part of the brain that we enter is called the brain stem. And the three parts of the brain stem are the medulla, which is this section here, and then we have the pons, and we have the midbrain. So the medulla, pons, and the midbrain, those are the three parts of the brain stem. Now let's look at the functions of those three parts. First, we have the midbrain, and that's involved in processes such as vision, hearing, eye movement, and body movement. Then we have the medulla, and that is involved in maintaining vital body functions such as breathing and heart rate. So you'll notice these are the autonomic processes. In other words, these are the processes that are going to happen whether you think about it or not.
The temporal lobe is responsible for organization of sensory input, language, and memory. Symptoms of a damaged temporal lobe include disturbance of auditory sensation and perception, disturbance of selective attention of auditory and visual input, disorders of visual perception, impaired organization and categorization of verbal material, disturbance of language comprehension, impaired long-term memory, altered personality and affective behavior, and altered sexual behavior. There is a difference when there is a damage to the right lobe and the left lobe. Damage to the right lobe includes loss of inhibition of talking and impaired memory for nonverbal material, while damage to the left lobe includes disturbed recognition of words and impaired memory for verbal material.
Temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are important for emotional response, the amygdala and its connections to the hypothalamus and frontal lobes, and memory, the hippocampus and limbic connections. Clinically, the main tasks for temporal lobe function are those of memory, particularly declarative memory.
There are many accommodations for students with traumatic brain injuries. Some testing strategies are enlarged materials, extended time, avoid more than one test per day, and allow students to type answers if needed. Some learning strategies include using checklists, using enlarged work when possible, color code to highlight important information, and break down tasks into smaller tasks. Some environmental strategies are a shortened school day, have someone carry a book or backpack, reduce distance between classes, and supply extra books for at home. Some behavioral strategies could be avoid confrontational approach, give immediate feedback for positive and negative behaviors, set clear and concise limits, and to let the student have a quiet place for when a break is needed.
We took turns driving through the night.
The Smith family of Mount Vernon was traveling by RV to Colorado.
It was about 4 o'clock in the morning when we were hit by a semi. And Will and his sister Abby were both asleep in the bed in the back of the RV, and so they were both ejected.
There were flames coming over the windshield, and I turned around and I went through the opening into the back of the RV and fell out onto the road. I ran down the road to stop the oncoming vehicles and then looked for the children in the debris. I just had this impending doom that I was going to find bodies instead of, you know, Abby and Will alive.
Abby's injuries were minor, but Will's were not.
And I found Will and I made sure kept him still, made sure his airway was okay. Simple stuff that I could do, and put my hand on his heart, and he was still alive.
Will was flown to the closest hospital in Kearney, Nebraska. He suffered a traumatic brain injury and was in the ICU for 5 weeks.
He ended up having craniotomy on both sides of his. They had to remove both sides of his skull, so he had a lot of damage.
Once he was stable, Will was flown closer to home to Nationwide Children's Hospital.
You know, in the United States, the Children's is one of the best hospitals for children to go to, especially if there are real complications and serious things. And that was the message that we got. It was very reassuring.
Will spent nearly 4 months at Nationwide Children's. When he arrived, he wasn't able to do much. But on our rehab floor, Will learned again how to eat, talk, and walk with assistance.
Do you remember being in Children's?
Yeah.
You do?
We're not just a number on a piece of paper. We're an actual family and going through a lot. And the people that work at Children's remember that.
Will developed strong relationships with our staff, including Nurse Lynn Sagona.
Will was Batman, she was Robin on Halloween. She was one of his favorite nurses.
Will is a character. He is the kind of person that you never know what is going to come out of his mouth, but he's just a big sweetheart. I mean, he'll go from giving you a hard time and making jokes with you to telling you, you know, I love you and blowing you kisses.
Shortly before Christmas, Will graduated rehab and was discharged from Nationwide Children's.
Christmas that year was just the best Christmas we've had, the whole family together.
He came such a long way from coming to us and really just laying in a bed and not doing a whole lot to taking steps in a walker.
The care he received was, it was amazing, yeah.
Inspired by the care and compassion her brother received, Emily ran last year's nationwide Children's Columbus Marathon, raising money and awareness for Will and patients just like him. Will was waiting for her near the end.
We were hanging out at the, 25-mile mark, and we timed when Emily would come by.
My dad had him standing, which was awesome. Because he obviously can't do it by himself, so my dad was holding him up, and it was really cool.
Emily, her dad, and other family members are running this year too, but this year is different.
Will Smith.
Because Will has been chosen as a patient champion.
Well, where are you at? What are you gonna do when you see me run by? Oh! You will not!
Dad's running.
Dad's running the half. We'll see about that.
And our logo has always been willpower.
We have Team Willpower.
I just thought of him, and he can't walk yet, but it's just such an inspiration.
I mean, he has never one time been upset, angry, ask why this has happened. Yeah. It's always, he's always positive about everything.
What can you say when a kid, 12-year-old boy, now 14, is battling the way he is, but then he tells his mom, I'm okay. It's okay, Mom. It's pretty cool. So that's willpower.